Imagine this: a room dripping with power, medals gleaming under crystal chandeliers, generals laughing like gods among men. But what if the real legend is the man scrubbing the floors? Welcome to Stories Fear, where hidden heroes come alive. The Officers' Club at Ramstein Air Base was a sanctuary of success. A meticulously curated bubble of polished mahogany, aged leather, and the quiet, confident hum of power. The air itself seemed different here, filtered and scented with expensive scotch and the faint metallic tang of awarded medals. Portraits of stoic four-star generals from decades past stared down from the walls, their painted eyes serving as silent judges of the current generation. Tonight, the club was alive, celebrating a successful NATO logistics exercise. Laughter, light and brittle, echoed off the vaulted ceilings as young officers orbited the gravitational center of the room. Brigadier General Marcus Thorn. Thorn was a man sculpted from ambition. His jaw was sharp. His gaze was sharper, and his uniform was a work of art, defying the very concept of wrinkles. He was a master of supply chains, a prodigy of procurement, a man who could move mountains of material across continents with a flurry of keystrokes. But the terrain of the human heart was foreign to him, and the dirt of a real war had never touched the soles of his immaculate boots. His authority was derived not from shared hardship in the field, but from the unyielding enforcement of regulations. He saw the world as a grand checklist, and his primary duty was to find and publicly admonish any box left unchecked. His gaze, sweeping the room with an almost predatory sense of ownership, snagged on a discordant note in his symphony of perfection. In a corner, almost lost in the long shadows cast by a towering bookshelf of military history, a man was cleaning. An old man, probably nearing 70, whose gray janitorial jumpsuit seemed to absorb the opulent light of the room and radiate a quiet humility. This was Arthur Jenkins. His movements were slow, deliberate, marked by a slight limp that favored his left leg. He polished the brass nameplate on a display case containing a Vietnam-era flight helmet with a reverence that seemed entirely out of place for his station. He was a ghost at the feast, a necessary but invisible functionary whose presence was to Thorn an affront. Leaning toward a trio of sycophantic captains, Thorn lowered his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Gentlemen, a teachable moment," he began, a cruel smirk touching his lips. "The chain of command is not just a diagram. It's a representation of value. At the top, decision-makers. At the bottom," he gestured with his chin toward the old janitor, "note the lack of bearing, the casual disregard for the decorum of this institution. Such things, if left unaddressed, are like rust. They corrode the very structure of our discipline." The captains nodded eagerly, their eyes reflecting their general's casual disdain. Emboldened by his captive audience, Thorn set his scotch down with a decisive click and strode across the Persian rug, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick pile. The ambient chatter of the room seemed to follow his progress, conversations faltering as dozens of pairs of eyes locked onto him. They sensed a spectacle was imminent. Thorn stopped directly behind Arthur, who was now carefully wiping down the glass of the display case. His reflection, a stooped, blurry figure against the history preserved within. "Attendant!" Thorn's voice was like a whip crack in the hushed room. "This is a restricted function for commissioned officers and their invited guests. Your duties were to be concluded before 1800 hours. Explain your presence." Arthur finished a long, smooth wipe before straightening up. A slow and painful process that caused his back to emit a faint popping sound. He turned, his face a complex map of wrinkles etched by time and hardship. His eyes, a pale and washed-out blue, held a profound weariness, but they met the general's gaze without flinching. "My apologies, General," he said, his voice raspy with age. The event supervisor requested I remain on standby in case of any spills. Just trying to keep the place looking its best for you, gentlemen. Thorn let out a short, sharp huff of derisive air. Looking its best. Your very presence here detracts from the atmosphere. This club is a monument to warriors, to pilots who faced down MiGs over Hanoi, to strategists who outmaneuvered the Soviets. It is a sacred space. It is not a utility closet for you to loiter in. He ran a critical eye over Arthur's worn jumpsuit, the faint stains of bleach and cleaning fluid on the knees. Frankly, it's an embarrassment. The insult, so personal and so public, hung in the air like poison gas. The room had fallen into a deep, uncomfortable silence. This was no longer a simple correction. It was a public shaming. Arthur's weathered face remained impassive, a mask of practiced neutrality. I understand, sir. I'll gather my things and leave you to your event. But Thorn hadn't squeezed all the juice from his pathetic little power play. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a tone of feigned curiosity that was somehow more insulting than his previous outburst. Tell me, old man, since you seem so comfortable in this Hall of Heroes, did you ever do your part? Did you ever wear a uniform? Or has your entire contribution to this nation been waged with a mop and a bucket? He looked back at his captains, a self-satisfied arch to his eyebrows. The weight of every stare in the room pressed down on Arthur. He looked at the floor for a long moment, at the intricate patterns of the rug, before his pale blue eyes lifted to meet Thorn's again. There was a flicker of something ancient in them, a spark of a long-banked fire. Yes, General, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable density of truth. I served. Thorn's smirk widened. Oh, you served. Wonderful, he exclaimed with theatrical joy. Do tell us all. I'm fascinated. Were you a clerk? A typist pushing papers at some forgotten records facility in Fort Dix? Perhaps a cook's assistant ensuring the officer's gravy was never lumpy. There's no shame in it, of course, he added, the lie thick in his mouth. Every cog in the machine has its purpose, no matter how small or insignificant. As Arthur bent down to place a bottle of polish back into his cart, the cuff of his jumpsuit rode up his forearm, revealing a piece of skin that hadn't seen the sun in 50 years. There, faded to a blurry greenish-gray, was a tattoo of a snake, coiled and ready to strike. Thorn's eyes, trained to spot any detail out of place, locked onto it. This was the final piece he needed for his performance. And what pretzel is that? He asked, pointing a rigid, accusatory finger. A memento of your fierce battles with a clogged drain? A symbol of your daring supply runs to the PX? Every soldier, no matter how far from the fight, loves to give himself a fearsome nickname. A call sign. He leaned in, his voice a stage whisper meant for the entire room. I must know. What was the terrifying call sign they gave the man who cleaned the latrines? Sponge 6? Captain Comet? The young officers tittered obediently. Thorn's grin was one of pure triumph. He had cornered his prey. He had reduced the old man to a caricature for his own amusement. Speak up, he commanded. I want to hear it. What was your call sign? Arthur straightened up one last time. The stooped shoulders seemed to square themselves almost imperceptibly. The weariness in his eyes vanished, burned away by that strange hot spark from deep within. The ambient hum of the club's ventilation system seemed to fall silent. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. Arthur's gaze was no longer deferential. It was hard, like chipped granite. He drew a slow, quiet breath. When he spoke, his voice was a gravelly whisper that held the chilling authority of a long-forgotten ghost. My call sign, he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into a deep well, was Viper 1. the name landed in the room and detonated. For Thorne and the younger generation of officers, it was meaningless. Just a slightly more dramatic name than the ones he'd mocked. But for a select few, the name was a key to a locked room in the deepest, darkest basement of military history. At the far end of the bar, Command Sergeant Major Frank Kowalski, a man whose face was a testament to combattants in every hellhole from the Mekong Delta to the Hindu Kush, dropped his glass of bourbon. It shattered on the marble floor. The sound an explosion in the dead quiet. Kowalski's blood had drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. He wasn't looking at a janitor anymore. He was staring at a myth. He'd heard that name once, and only once, whispered over a crackling radio frequency during a long-range recon patrol in Cambodia in 1971. A voice from nowhere directing an AC-130 Spectre gunship to erase an entire NVA battalion that was about to overrun his position. A voice that had identified itself only as Viper 1 before vanishing back into the static of the jungle. The other senior NCOs in the room had the same reaction. A master gunnery sergeant from the Marine Embassy Guard contingent took an involuntary step backward, his hand reflexively going to where a sidearm would be. A chief master sergeant in charge of base security looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The atmosphere didn't just get tense. It became heavy, suffocating, charged with a primal fear and a kind of sacred awe that the officers couldn't comprehend. But here's the hook that stops you cold. What if the most powerful man in the room just walked in and he's saluting the janitor? If you believe that true heroes often wear the humblest uniforms, hit that like button right now on Stories Sphere to honor their silent service. Thorne, insulated by his own ignorance, only saw the janitor's defiance. Viper 1. How very dramatic. He sneered, though the visceral reactions of his own senior enlisted had planted a tiny cold seed of doubt in his gut. A big name for a small man. You think that impresses? His voice trailed off as the great oak doors of the main entrance were thrown open with a percussive boom that silenced him completely. Framed in the doorway stood General Wallace, the 4-star commander of USAF, a man whose quiet displeasure was more feared than an enemy artillery barrage. His face was carved from granite, and his eyes, famous for their ability to see through steel, were blazing. He was flanked by 2 stone-faced men in dark suits, whose lapel pins identified them as agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Wallace's presence was a hurricane making landfall in a teacup. He was supposed to be testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee in Washington, D.C. Ignoring the stunned salutes and gaping mouths of everyone in the room, General Wallace strode forward with the unstoppable momentum of an armored column. His eyes scanned the bizarre scene, the shattered glass, the terrified NCOs, the pompous brigadier general, and the quiet old janitor. Wallace's gaze flew past Thorne's single star as if it were a speck of lint, and locked onto Arthur Jenkins with an intensity that made the air crackle. He came to a halt 2 feet from Arthur, his posture ramrod straight. In the stunned silence, he snapped to attention and delivered the sharpest, most profound salute of his storied career. It was a gesture of utter, unconditional respect. A salute a general gives not to a subordinate, but to a legend. "Mr. Jenkins," Wallace said, his voice rumbling with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "Sir, it is an honor beyond words. Forgive this intrusion." He held the salute, his hand trembling slightly before slowly lowering it. Only then did he turn his head, his gaze falling upon the now petrified Brigadier General Thorne, like a physical weight. "General Thorne," Wallace said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm whisper, "I am going to ask you a question, and I want you to consider your answer very carefully. Do you have any conceivable idea who you are speaking to?" Thorne, his face ashen, his mind reeling, could only manage a pathetic stammer. "Sir, he's the custodial engineer." Wallace's eyes closed for a brief second, as if in immense pain. "Let me be the last person to ever have to educate you, Brigadier General. You are not fit to polish the boots this man has forgotten he owned. The janitor you have been humiliating for the last 10 minutes is the man the entire clandestine services community of the United States and NATO knew by one designation, and one designation only, Viper 1. Wallace took a deliberate step toward Thorne, who flinched as if expecting a blow. This man led him a CDSOG Spike Recon Team Viper across the fence into Laos and Cambodia for 3 straight years. His team was so effective at disruption and assassination that the North Vietnamese army put a bounty on his head worth more than a brand new fighter jet. He was captured once, taken to a POW camp that didn't exist, a place so brutal it was known only as the kennel. He escaped 2 weeks later, carrying 2 of his wounded men on his back for 80 miles through dense jungle. Wallace's voice grew harder, each word a hammer blow. After Vietnam, the CIA recruited him for their Special Activities Division. That tattoo you mocked? It's the last thing a dozen Stasi colonels and KGB assassins ever saw. He is the man who walked into the East German sector of the Volkov network safe house, a place the BND and MI6 said was impenetrable, and single-handedly dismantled their entire European operation in one night. Operation Serpent's Kiss. Look it up. Oh, wait. You can't. It's classified Umbra Cosmic, a level of secrecy that you, General, do not have the clearance to even know exists. Every member of that mission was declared dead before it began to give the agency total deniability. He was a ghost. He pointed a shaking finger at Arthur. And Ljubljana prison. You've heard of it. He is the only Western operative to ever be held at its deepest level and walk out on his own 2 feet. He spent 6 months in darkness, and when he escaped, he did so with a complete order of battle for the Soviet Union's Western group of forces. The intelligence he brought back single-handedly averted a surprise invasion of Western Europe and prevented World War III. The 4-star general now stood nose to nose with the brigadier general. And you, a glorified quartermaster whose greatest hardship was the delayed shipment of office furniture, you dared stand in this room on floors he now humbly cleans and question his service. You are a walking, talking insult to the uniform you wear. Wallace's voice dropped to its most lethal whisper. Be in my office at 0600 tomorrow. Bring your full dress uniform, your resignation letter, and whatever is left of your honor. Your career in the United States Air Force is over. Now get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. Utterly and completely broken, Thorne turned and stumbled out of the club. His public execution complete. Wallace watched him go, then addressed the silent, shell-shocked room. Let this be an indelible lesson for every one of you. The true heroes of this nation are not always the ones with stars on their shoulders. They are the quiet professionals, the ghosts, the men like Arthur Jenkins who sacrificed everything in the dark so that you could stand here safe in the light. He turned back to Arthur, his expression softening with a deep, profound respect. Art, he said gently, it's over. Your nation has not forgotten you. The director sends his personal deepest apologies. There's been a clerical error regarding your service benefits and pension going back 30 years. It's been fixed. It's time to come home. As General Wallace gently guided Arthur Jenkins toward the door, a ripple went through the room. The command sergeant major was the first, snapping to the most rigid, heartfelt position of attention of his life. The rest of the NCOs followed suit instantly. Then the officers, one by one, their faces a mixture of shame and awe, all snapped to attention, their hands rising in a salute that was not for a janitor, but for a titan. Subscribe to Stories Fear right now to hear more incredible stories of the quiet professionals who served in the shadows and were forgotten by the history they secretly wrote.